Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a Senior Vice President here at CSIS. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to be having a conversation about renewing American leadership in the fight against corruption. I want to welcome our hundreds of online viewers who are live streaming this event for this very important conversation on the fight against corruption, which is a major obstacle that hinders development because it diverts funding away from intended parties and takes trust away from institutions. The Biden-Harris administration has made combating corruption, including kleptocracy, curbing illicit finance, and holding corrupt actors accountable, a core focus of its national and foreign policy agenda, which is excellent news. As you know, CSIS has been a strong partner with the U.S. government supporting research efforts aimed at identifying and rooting out corruption. We published a report last year, my colleague and I, Chris Metzger, on taking leadership in the anti-corruption agenda again for the United States, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because of the era of great power competition that we find ourselves in. So we think this is great news at CSIS. We have some really interesting and thoughtful panelists to join us today. We have James Walsh, who's the Acting Assistant Secretary for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Very grateful to him to be here. We have Mr. Paul Ahern, who serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, or what also known as TFFC. We also have our friend Shannon Green, who used to be with us at CSIS. We're really happy to have Shannon back virtually at CSIS. She's a senior advisor to the administrator at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where she is leading efforts to elevate and strengthen anti-corruption. Thank you, Shannon, for being here. We're also really happy to have Julia Roich, who is the president of Partners Global and a former ABA enrollee. That means the American Bar Association country director. Julia represents the next generation of leadership in the international development field as the president of one of the most preeminent global organizations dedicated to innovative governance solutions for development. So we've got a really great set of panelists. I'm really grateful. Let me quickly remind our online viewers that this is an interactive online event. And I want to invite all of you to participate through questions for our panel of U.S. government officials and partners on opportunities for the United States to lead in this critical space. To submit your questions, please go to our website at csis.org and click on Ask Live Questions Here button. I will then select a few of those questions as a moderator for our panelists to answer later in the conversation. The anti-corruption work of the U.S. government is in the spotlight more than ever. This month witnessed the UN General Assembly special session specifically focused on anti-corruption, the release of the National Security Study Memorandum on the fight against corruption, and the Administration Summit for Democracy, which is on the horizon. I also think it's the global month for anti-kleptocracy. I'm going to have to fact check that, but I think that's also the case. So this is a critical month, a critical moment. While several initiatives led by the private sector and civil society continue to focus on corruption, it is worth exploring ways in which the U.S. government may lead global anti-corruption efforts and in doing so promote the rule of law, which is why we're all here today. So let's jump right into our conversation. So let me start with the panelists and start with our friends in the U.S. government. We have this new National Security Study Memorandum on the fight against corruption. How has the Biden-Harris administration's prioritization of anti-corruption efforts impacted your work at your respective agencies? And are there new tools and/or initiatives that you will be rolling out to support these efforts? Let me start first with Acting Assistant Secretary Walsh.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you to CSIS for gathering us all here today to discuss this really important issue. I think your opening remarks really set the stage quite well as to why corruption around the globe must be elevated as a top national security and foreign policy priority. And the Biden-Harris administration, as you mentioned, has done just that. So, to put the severity of this issue in economic terms, The UN did a study in 2018 and estimated $1 trillion is paid in bribes every year, while an estimated 2.6 trillion are stolen annually through corruption. This is an amount equivalent to more than 5% of the global GDP, or if combined, it would be literally the fourth largest GDP in the world. And of course, there's the destabilizing factors of corruption, which we've all seen. And I'm afraid COVID pandemic has only made matters worse. So as mentioned, right out the gate, the Biden-Harris administration has prioritized anti-corruption and just recently, as you said, announced the National Security Study Memorandum on corruption. This is really important because it's going to elevate the fight against corruption for the entire US government. And this report will be due to the president in about 200 days. But of course, we're not waiting for that 200-day report. We're actually moving out, as you mentioned, and we have some ideas. So I think the United States already enforces one of the most robust anti-corruption frameworks in the world. Well, we are the first to criminalize foreign bribery, and enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which DOJ manages, has hit historic highs. On asset recovery, by working collaboratively with our foreign partners, the U.S. has targeted over $3.4 billion in corruption proceeds, confiscated over $1.6 billion of these assets, and in partnership with foreign counterparts, have recovered and returned more than $1 billion in the past 2 years alone. We're also focusing on promoting accountability for corrupt actors globally through sanctions, visa restrictions, and other similar tools. And I'm sure Paul from Treasury is going to highlight that as well. But the fight against corruption is common and share responsibilities for all countries. And the administration recognizes that we will only be successful if we work together with international partners. And that's why I'm glad you really highlighted this, Dan, why the president has pledged to host a summit for democracy. Now, this is going to bring together the world's democracies to confront authoritarianism, fight corruption, and promote respect for human rights in the home abroad. So back here at the State Department, one element we want to amplify is our public messaging. And we have called out bad actors in the past, and we will continue to do so. Since 2020, state has publicly designated over 40 corrupt current and former foreign government officials and their family members. But we must also recognize anti-corruption leaders and innovators around the world. And this is something new that we're doing. We recently launched an Anti-Corruption Championship Award. And this is a one way of basically acknowledging those courageous people fighting against corruption. The Secretary's Award is going to honor individuals who have demonstrated leadership, courage in preventing, exposing, and combating corruption. And our hope is that it will encourage even more champions to take on the mantle around and fight corruption around the world. Within my bureau at INL, we're going to continue to play a critical role in rooting out corruption in all forms. You mentioned rule of law. Our programs focus on that, and especially the capacity of the criminal justice sector. And we're actually working in 90 countries, and we're going to put that corruption element at a high level and focus the flashlight on it, particularly as we identify, investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate complex corruption cases. So we recognize that governments can't do it alone, and that's why the department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, or DRL, as many of you know them, they're redoubling efforts to strengthen the ability of civil society and media to reveal corruption and foster public demand for change and address these weak governance and poor human rights conditions that cultivate corruption. Still, Dan, I think you're right. We have a lot to do, and we plan on upping our game. The proceeds of corruption cross national borders. They can affect economies and political systems far from their origin. And anonymous shell companies, opaque financial systems, shady professional service providers, they enable the movement and laundering of illicit financial wealth, including in the United States and other financial centers. So the bottom line is this: as corruption threatens us, it becomes a U.S. national security, and it threatens democracy itself. It inhibits growth, investment opportunities, it undermines the stability of our democratic partners, and it drives U.S.-bound migration as ordinary citizens flee weak regimes for greater opportunities. And so the Biden-Harris administration, they know this, and we are taking some bold steps to address it. So thanks for that very good question, Dan.
Good. Paula Hearn, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I'll just echo my thanks to you and to CSIS for having this conversation. Obviously, it's very important to be having right now. Taking this from a Treasury perspective, Secretary Yellen very early on had made implementation of anti-money laundering reforms among her highest priorities. And obviously the prioritization of anti-corruption efforts by the administration writ large are linked to that, because, you know, as many of you no doubt know, corruption and money laundering are intrinsically linked. The proceeds of corruption are often laundered to conceal these ill-gotten gains. So we're focused on that as a department. We also are aware of the disproportionate impact that corruption has on the poor and the most vulnerable, and also the fact that it's a drag on economic growth, and especially now, countering it will be essential to a robust economic recovery. The United States obviously is the world's largest economy, and also due to the primacy of our currency, our markets, and our banking system, has a very important role to play in combating illicit financing, and in particular illicit financing related to corruption. And so we have a number of different tools and authorities that the administration's focus on corruption are bringing to bear on this particular problem. One has to do with our international engagements, both through multilateral forums and bilaterally with key partners and with vulnerable jurisdictions. You know, we use these interactions to promote and increase financial transparency in the international financial system. And primarily, or at least one of the major ways we do this is through leading the U.S. delegation to the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF. Developing and implementing the recommendations from the FATF is a key means of combating illicit financing and corruption. And one of the things that we have focused on, in particular at this stage, is on promoting effective beneficial ownership disclosure requirements. Basically, corrupt actors exploit vulnerabilities through opaque beneficial ownership structures to hide and launder their illicit proceeds. And, you know, until very recently, actually, the United States had a significant gap in our anti-money laundering architecture because there was no means of collecting beneficial ownership information at the time of corporate formation. That gap was narrowed, if not closed, through the Corporate Transparency Act that passed earlier this year. And so we're in the process of developing the regulations and implementing those requirements. Having a beneficial ownership collection regime now in the United States gives us the moral authority to go back out to the international community and to promote you know, similar requirements to, again, sort of close that vulnerability in the international financial system. In addition, Jim mentioned economic sanctions. You know, we have a particular sanctions program, the Global Magnitsky program, also known as GLOMAG, that allows us to designate for economic sanctions human rights abusers and corrupt actors. We have used that. I can talk about that maybe a little bit later. We are increasing our use of that and looking for other opportunities to use that particular authority. We also, students of our sanctions authorities will notice that over time there's been an increase in having authorities with respect to other country-based or other types of sanctions programs that allow us to designate corrupt actors as part of those programs. And so, again, we are looking for opportunities to use those authorities. It has also been a priority of the Biden-Harris administration to prioritize multilateral action rather than unilateral action. And for us, that in particular means the use of the sanctions authorities. You know, a number of jurisdictions have put in place or are considering similar sanctions authorities to our GLOMAG authority. That includes Canada and the United Kingdom. We have taken joint action with those jurisdictions. We have also used our international engagements to try and promote those types of sanctions authorities in jurisdictions that don't have them, and are, as I said, continuing to look for complementary actions that we can all take in this space. And then I'll just mention briefly another initiative that the Treasury Department has in place. Also came out of the law that included the Corporate Transparency Act, which was to set up a kleptocracy rewards pilot program. And what this allows for basically is for us to in consultation with other agencies, to pay rewards to individuals who provide tips that may lead to the seizure and recovery of assets that are the proceeds of kleptocracy. And so again, we're putting that into place right now. It's a potentially very valuable tool that is newly in place for us.
Great.
And I think with that, I will stop and
thank you.
Look forward to the questions.
Great. Shannon Green, thanks for being here. Welcome home virtually, if I can say that. Nice to see you. You're now back at AID. I'm so happy to see you there. How is this new and how is this sort of this new focus on anti-corruption? How is AID thinking about this, and how is AID responding?
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for bringing us all together. I think you rightly pointed out that foreign assistance is really a central capability and tool in the fight against corruption. So I'm very happy to be here representing USAID. So as you and most others on this call probably know, USAID's mission has always included fighting corruption and enhancing transparency, accountability, and good governance. And the reason for that is for many of the reasons that my colleagues said, in terms of corruption fundamentally preventing USAID from achieving its mission of country-led development. So when we see corrupt officials siphoning off public resources, they are depriving their citizens of the investments that are so desperately needed to lift people out of poverty, to improve health outcomes, and to ensure that their children are getting a good education. We also know that when dark money is allowed to flow into elections and political parties, it distorts these processes and fundamentally shapes citizens' confidence in democracy itself. And as some of my colleagues also mentioned, we've seen how authoritarians around the world have very effectively taken advantage of corruption to consolidate their rule internally and also to undermine democratic norms and institutions in other countries. So for USAID, this is really a central issue and always has been. But what's new is that we are addressing corruption with the urgency and resolve that it requires. So under President Biden and Vice President Harris's leadership, the United States has identified the fight against corruption as a core national interest. And what I've seen is that this prioritization has really been embraced across the US government, as evidenced by the fact that this is the second panel that I'm doing with my interagency colleagues in just the first couple of weeks that I've been back on board. And I truly have not seen this kind of coalescing around an issue within the US government where all principles are really aligned on the need to address something with like a great sense of urgency and clarity. So that's been really satisfying to see. I believe as a result of this momentum, we have the best chance in decades to address this problem of corruption holistically and systematically. So within USAID, we're absolutely using this momentum to renew our efforts and leadership in the anti-corruption space. Administrator Power has been extremely forceful in both her denunciation of corruption and her support for anti-corruption reformers and activists. Under her leadership, we're taking concrete steps to position USAID to meet this moment, including first by standing up a new agency-level anti-corruption task force that I'll be leading. This task force is really going to allow us to surge staff and focus on these efforts at a time where I think it is needed the most and when we can really make a difference. So the first priority of this task force is going to be to drive the comprehensive review of USAID's anti-corruption policies, programming, resources, and practices as required by the National Security Study Memorandum that you mentioned. The task force will also work across USAID to rejuvenate our anti-corruption strategies and approaches, develop new programs and mechanisms, and really importantly, ensure that anti-corruption approaches and sort of the mindset that we need to bring to this issue is integrated across all of USAID's work, whether that be in health, education, climate change, humanitarian assistance, or biodiversity. Part of this will also include developing new approaches to generating the political will that's required to make real reforms when it comes to anti-corruption, and also to deal with the inevitable pushback that we're going to get from partner governments, and I've already started to get because corruption is such a politically sensitive issue. Administrator Power has also been very forward-leaning in talking about the centrality of anti-corruption in USAID's work. She's consistently highlighted the importance of tackling corruption as part of our overall mission. And for those of you who are watching the trip that she took to the Northern Triangle this week, she has taken every opportunity to have very frank discussions with leaders about the need for real results in fighting corruption. So yesterday, she was speaking at the Central American University Corruption Conference in El Salvador, and she explained that corruption is not the cost of doing business. It is what keeps foreign direct investment away. The rule of law is not a nicety. It is what gives businesses confidence. It's also what gives citizens confidence that when they are wronged, they have the ability to seek amends. And Dan, because this is such a significant priority for USAID, we included $50 million in funds for anti-corruption in the president's FY 2022 budget. And that's in addition to the bilateral funding that we allocate for anti-corruption. If these funds are appropriated by Congress, it will give us the ability to rapidly respond to new windows of opportunity and deterioration when it comes to corruption. It will give us the ability to enhance our regional and global programming and strengthen our ability to address the globalized aspects of corruption, including illicit finance and the variety of networks that are really transnational in scope. These funds will also help us support the brave journalists and activists who expose corruption, seize on opportunities to push legal or regulatory reform, and strengthen the independence of oversight institutions. Finally, as part of this upgrade and prioritization within USAID, we're thinking through the best ways to position USAID's strongest asset, which is our extensive country-level footprint and bilateral programming in combating corruption. We're examining ways to expand both our local and global partnerships, especially with the courageous civil society activists, investigative journalists, and anti-corruption reformers who are the real heroes in the fight against corruption. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to the Q&A part of the discussion.
Thanks, Shannon. Julia, what would you like to see the U.S. government do more of in this space?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan. And it is an honor to be the one civil society voice with my U.S. government colleagues. And Partners Global does function as an international network. So while I'm here based in DC, I'm really here on behalf of the 20 Partners Network members, who are local civil society organizations who have more than 30 years of working on these types of good governance and transparency and citizen engagement issues around the world. And we have had a long-standing relationship as an implementing partner with USAID and all of the different CSO or State Department branches, INL, CSO, et cetera. So my remarks are really from that perspective. I reached out to a lot of different civil society colleagues in preparation for these remarks. I didn't want it to just be Julia Roig, because this is a really privileged space for me to be able to give these recommendations. And as you know, there's a wide diversity of civil society actors. We don't just come at this problem from one angle. We are looking at investigative journalism. There's think tanks studying the impact of policies. There's watchdog organizers, campaigners. We all have a place in this broad constellation. And my personal experience is from global civil society, sitting on an OGP, kind of NGO pillar, EITI, SDG 16, the way that civil society is involved in these conversations. But again, also thinking and working with my civil society colleagues around the world in very grassroots context, what has been mentioned, sometimes very dangerous circumstances. So here are my kind of general remarks. None of this is going to be earth-shatteringly new. I just feel the need to say it again and really prioritize these messages. We all know that corruption is a systemic problem. And so then therefore, if really this is going to be a priority for the US government, the way that we work on this problem is going to have to change. Because as an implementing partner, working across different agencies and with many other different funders in the EU and the World Bank, we know that the way that programming is designed and funded and implemented keeps us siloed and makes it very difficult to work systemically. And so I really don't think this is a matter of more money. and additional staffing. I think it's changing the way that we see this problem and work on this problem as a global community. And I'm saying this really as a friend and as a real ally, as are many of my civil society colleagues in this space. And that I know it's easier said than done to make change within government and to work systemically, because what is this really going to look like in practice? I have a couple of thoughts and recommendations. I know that we're here talking about US foreign policy, but we know that corruption at home is just as an important issue for the fight against global corruption. And we are talking about kleptocracy and those networks that are allowed to grow, not only reinforce the dynamics within these global systems, but I think that there are those who take the cues from what's allowed to happen in the United States. And so as a part of this interagency work, Department of Justice has to also be strengthened. And I know that's a part of the agenda, because we've heard President Biden numerous times say that foreign policy is domestic policy and domestic policy is foreign policy. So to the extent that ethics rules, conflict of interest, all of the enforcement, it's going to be really important to our international colleagues, both in civil society and government, to see that we're taking the corruption agenda just as seriously at home as we are overseas. Now, what I would like to say then, what that is going to look like for then civil society engagement. We're in this space very much used to working with civil society networks around the world who are then holding their governments accountable. And I'd really like to point out that we have kind of networks of networks, coalitions of coalitions, movements now globally, the US movements and our counterparts around the world are going to have to be working more in sync. And I think that then therefore that the foreign assistance apparatus is also going to have to be used to those international networks, including domestic movement leaders as a part of those discussions, a part of those conferences on par with our international colleagues. And there's a lot of work that's been written. I shared an article by Maria Stefan, my colleague, who's been looking at how domestic social movement actors are going to be really supportive of their foreign policy agenda. But then at the programmatic level, what does it look like to work in a systems way? I know that we talked about the urgency that we feel. We feel this urgency, but sometimes system work means slowing down a little bit, doing the analysis, the deep analysis of what is the real problem set that we are working on. Because I know that in this discussion, we're talking about prosecuting the bad apples. And we can't only see the problem set as a technical capacity issue, a political economy issue. It's not just one issue. There's also a bad orchard that needs to be addressed. And so then therefore, I would really ask my colleagues who are going through this programmatic review, we're not starting from scratch. There's so much work that's being done, and there's a lot of analysis that's been done. And so whether it's the tools that Sarah Chase has done to look at network analysis in countries like Honduras or in the Central Asian region, Cheyenne Church has done a lot of really great work on looking at causal loops in Uganda. And it takes time, again, to look at those systems, see where the levers of change are going to make the most impact, both on the prevention side and the enforcement side. And that's probably one of my main messages, is we can't forget about all of the great work to prevent corruption. Because finally, what is this really going to take? And this is so not sexy, but it's going to take procurement reform with the way that we give money to those colleagues to make change. We're going to be investing in those actors, but we can't projectize systematic change. It can't be according to those objectives and those goals. And I know politically that you all have to respond to Congress. You need to talk about money spent, prosecutors trained, criminals behind bars, new laws passed. but the systems that we need to change, we need to be looking at different kinds of indicators, how local change agents are working within those systems and how civil society is garnering that. Because then this is my last point, my almost last point, is that we are in a moment within the aid industry, and I'm saying this as an implementing partner and as an international non-for-profit, where we're having serious conversations about decolonizing aid. We've spent a whole year discussing how our system is not allowing for change agents within their own countries to have be empowered change agents. And I think that the days of an export model of the US government arriving in a country to say how things should happen based on our own best practices, based on our own Western model, those days are over. And so the way that we're being asked to change, I think that you're going to need to really think about the way that you give money, because I know INL really loves to place American lawyers within ministries around the world as one of those ways of giving foreign assistance. And I think we've got to start looking at these practices and how that actually is really a part of that systemic change, or is a really vicious cycle of not allowing that change to take place. And then my last point is just that we are really operating in a very polarized environment right now, both in the United States and around the world. We see polarization really growing. And some of my colleagues in the sector are a little bit worried about how corruption programming and messaging becomes weaponized, both here in the United States as we prosecute those big fish, and also overseas. And I think we have to have a deep commitment to a conflict sensitivity and not further damaging the polarizing dynamics around the world, because we know that when aid, military aid otherwise, is also conditioned for political priorities that we have in the United States, we lose credibility to be working on this. And so we have to be approaching this with just the utmost integrity, which I have no doubt the Biden administration is approaching it in that way. So thank you so much. I have a lot more to say about just the nuts and bolts of what's going on in civil society, but I'll save that for my next remarks. Thank you, Dan.
Very good. Thank you. So I want to give everyone a chance to talk about, there was this special assembly at the UN on anti-corruption. I'd love to hear from my USG colleagues about any important outcomes that came of that. I've got a number of interesting questions I'm getting from the audience, but I wanted to give my friends at the USG a chance to share any outcomes that came out of this, what's called the UNGAS.
And I'm actually going to defer to some of my colleagues on that, but I want to address the really important points that Julia made. I don't disagree with anything that she said, to be honest. I think there are a number of really critical points that she raised around the need for a holistic systems-based approach and really doing that analysis and getting a common operating picture of what are the threats and opportunities, and really understanding the power mapping and sort of what are the entry points for the US government, both diplomatically and in terms of our foreign assistance, and making sure that we are then approaching this challenge in the right way and programming money in a way that's actually going to make a difference, rather than tinkering at the margins, perhaps distorting systems in a way that exacerbate corruption. So that is absolutely sort of front and center in terms of our thinking. As well as, I don't know if you've heard Administrator Power also talk about decolonization and the importance of really shifting towards a model not of democracy promotion, or as you called it, sort of this export model, but really looking for opportunities to partner and to engage in mutual learning across the domestic and international spaces with the US government and sort of US activists on an equal playing field with the others that we were engaging with. So I wanted to pick up on that point. And then I think the final thing that was really interesting and important is modernizing the approach and the way that we program foreign assistance, and thinking about it in a much longer term sense, but also being really aware of the way that anti-corruption efforts can be weaponized And to that effect, I wanted to point out that the first sort of bucket within the National Security Study Memorandum process is an invitation to look at how do we modernize our systems, tools, and approaches. So it's not just about what we're doing, but how we're doing it. So in terms of USAID, that is definitely all on the agenda for this anti-corruption task force. I have no doubt that it is going to be extremely difficult. It's a really complex set of issues, and as you said, really political and really, touching on procurement reforms and other things that we've tried to address for a long time. They're all very important. So I just wanted to engage with the really critical points that Julia raised and reflect a bit on that.
Good. Thank you. Jim Walsh, either if you want to respond to anything that Julia Roy said or on the question I posed about UNGAS.
Yeah, Dan, that's a good question. Let me take the UNGAS question first, and I can jump in afterwards as the conversation continues. But I'm glad there's a lot of questions about it because it really was an important event. I think it was the first time the General Assembly held such an event since we developed the UNCAC, or the UN Convention Against Corruption. And so we really got a lot of new commitments. And there are also a lot of great side events, as many of you participated. But for most of you that know how these UN events take place, the hard work is getting the commitments. And that took a good 1.5 to 2 years to work on. And I'm really proud of the team here at the State Department, because unfortunately we had to fight really hard for some of these key commitments. But let me highlight just a couple of those. I think the one key commitment that we like is all member states made for the first time time-bound commitments to criminalize foreign bribery. And the goal is to do that by 2030. So this time-bound pledge is an important win for all the global fight against bribery. Of course, we have a lot of work to do, but at least we have that commitment. The United States also joined others in fighting hard for commitments that would have meaningful impact on civil society and media. And this is where we really had to fight. This included a commitment by all member states to provide the conditions for civil society to effectively contribute to achieving the objectives of the UNCAC. And it also includes ensuring that the non-government stakeholders are able to operate independently and without fear of reprisal because of their efforts. Of course, we'll have to watch that space as this unfolds. Another commitment the United States fought really hard for was the protection of reporting persons, including an explicit commitment for journalist protections. We wanted to went over this commitment to not only apply to investigating and prosecuting violence against journalists after it occurs, but also provide a safe and adequate environment to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. So I think these last two commitments in particular are really important. We know the fight against corruption is not really run through speeches; it's run really through the practitioners. So we really put a lot of work in ensuring that our practitioners, particularly civil society, anti-corruption activists, those journalists, all those stakeholders are really able to do their work in preventing, detecting, and exposing corruption.
Good. Paul, do you want to respond to anything that Julia said, or do you want to respond to the issue of UNGAS, or do you want to talk about any domestic initiatives that Treasury is working on in the anti-corruption space? Any of those topics?
Yeah, actually, all three I think I can link together. When it comes to the UNGAS, I mean, we had a particular outcome there. We announced this Kleptocracy pilot program. Just some of the things that Julia was saying. I mean, this discussion I think is sort of foreign policy focused, but we're aware of the vulnerabilities domestically that she mentioned, and this Kleptocracy assets recovery rewards program is a way at getting at foreign government officials who are stashing or laundering their ill-gotten gains in the U.S. financial system. We're hoping that by providing payments for lead information, that will give investigators another avenue of information to support their investigations, and so that they can better identify these proceeds that are in the United States, allow us to seize them and potentially repatriate them back to the benefit of the people they were stolen from. And I think the program as a whole, we are hoping will send a message to kleptocrats everywhere that even though the United States maintains an open financial system, it's closed to those who are going to treat the wealth of their nations as their own. Second point, I mentioned the new beneficial ownership provisions of the Corporate Transparency Act and our implementation of that right now. As I say, that was meant to address a domestic gap in our own AML CFT architecture. Even beyond that, though, we are focused on ensuring that within the United States, the competent authorities have access to not just beneficial ownership information, but to other quality and timely information, including other forms of financial intelligence to support their investigations. And then finally, I think one of the things we're also looking at, both as a domestic matter and as an international matter, and this is not a specific outcome of the UNGAS, but is sort of an outcome of our international engagements, which is to focus on mapping out supply chains, particularly of commodities that are at high risk for serving as laundering avenues for illicit proceeds, like precious metals and stones and jewels, and the international trade in those types of commodities. Could use, I think, some more focus by our international partners, and that's again one of the things that we are looking at in our international engagements. So hopefully I linked all three of those up.
Thank you. Julia, I think this is you made some very thoughtful and interesting and constructively provocative comments. Let me just put some, we did a whole report about 10 years ago arguing that we have a defense industrial base and we have a development industrial base. The development community doesn't like me saying that, but in essence, if you've got a big Ebola crisis, you don't hire, no offense, mom and pop NGO to deliver it. We hire John Snow or Chemonics or someone else to respond to that. The other issue is that we don't have enough bodies at AID to process teeny grants. Third, we've got a whole bunch of problems having to do with the rule set. There's 5,000 pages. There's a reason that there's a whole proliferation of DC-based organizations that do this stuff, because the rule set stinks and it's really complicated and it's never been simplified. And then fourth, part of the contract, I think, with folks who are skeptical about aid is that we in essence have a series of domestic implementers that we can kind of put the scarlet letter on if there is a malfeasance and say, you'll never do lunch in this town again. I can think of several groups over the last 10 years where that has happened, where the CEO has been sort of banished, to the outer edge. I'm not going to name any, but in essence, we have sort of like a scapegoat. So there's a system that's been set up, imperfect as it is. So I know we had the conversation like this in the Obama administration, and I think we're seeing this return. I'm open to it, but I also am skeptical because of sort of all of these issues. So if we really want to fix that kind of plumbing issues, that's very interesting. It's going to require a lot of FTEs, full-time employees at AID, and it's going to require some major fixes to make it darn simpler to do business with the federal government. And it probably also means that, it's some of the bigger complicated projects that we want to take on in the world. I would argue it'll be harder to do if we use, I think I'm all for local organizations, don't get me wrong, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say when I say we have a development industrial base, which, I've supported and been a part of in various ways. And I would argue all the organizations in Washington are part of the development industrial base. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, well, Dan, I don't necessarily want to derail this conversation, talk about procurement reform within development, right? We're here to talk about corruption. And while I do think the way we implement and fund our programs is part of the ecosystem that we've got to address, I see the greatest innovation taking place in the civil society sector right now. So when I say I don't think it's an issue of more money, I really mean that. And I'm saying that as somebody who would love a lot more money to do what I do, but it's the way that we work, and it's the way that we support these programs, and it's the way that we're thinking about the complementary types of programs that are getting funded. And so a couple quick points on that, and I didn't mean to deflect your question. It's just we could spend the next half hour just talking about, procurement reform, which count me in for that conversation, by the way. I have a lot to say, because partners, we operate on a totally different model. We work through local organizations that we helped to set up, and they're doing the work. And we constantly work ourselves out of a job. And so just a couple of quick thoughts about, I really wanted to be able to share some of what I think are some of the most innovative things happening in the sector right now. So we're talking a lot about, corruption with a big C in this group. I really don't want to forget about working at a very grassroots local government level. We do this in the peace and conflict sector all the time. Stabilization efforts are looking for those pockets of stability. And so obviously an islands of integrity approach, where we are looking for champions within local governments, who then, there's a whole body of work that's been championed by Ronnie McLean Avaroa, working with the writings of Robert Kierkegaard, that really says, let's work within those local institutions, let them demonstrate within their constituencies that it is possible for government to be accountable to citizens, to work efficiently, to be transparent. And then we link those islands of integrity together throughout a system. There is research that is shown that that actually does make a change. And I know there's a lot of people who think I'm naive, but we really believe in this. And that's what Partners has been doing in 15 countries around the world, with very deep evaluation indicators saying that it actually is making a difference, because it's almost like flexing that democratic muscle. It is possible. Because why is it impossible to demonstrate, or why is it so necessary to demonstrate that it's possible? I think the most interesting work happening in the sector right now is around social norms change. And Tufts University, Diana Chigas, again with Cheyenne Church, is looking at why is it that our institutional reforms, our capacity building, all of the oversight mechanisms aren't working. Why is that? And they really aren't. Let's be honest. In a lot of places, we're spending so much money. And I think it's because it really bumps up against the social norms in society. It's not the panacea, it's not the only thing, but what social norms really are is those unwritten rules that drive behavior in a group. And it's more powerful than individual attitudes. It's more powerful than written laws to influence our behavior. And there's some deep research, and we know then that work on, it's not strategic communications. It's not telling people to be better. It's really groups coming together and seeing their in-group acting in a different way. And so with that islands integrity approach, it's not just localized, it's connecting all of them. And then I want to say that, you know, the way that we invest in civil society is going to matter. So we've been accompanying our colleagues in Nigeria for more than 10 years now. And when I say we can't projectize this, I'm really making a plug for international civil society and those international networks of moral support and technical support and learning agendas together. We've seen so much innovation coming out of civil society in Nigeria, being more cohesive, being able to really come together around the OGP coalition and National Action Plan, for example. You know, tech, our colleagues at Partners West Africa, Nigeria are doing a lot of accountability within the institutions of the judicial sector. And so the way that civil society is also not necessarily just being a watchdog, not on the outside screaming about shaming and naming, but working within institutions, that also is going to strengthen those democratic values that an active civil society isn't something to be afraid of at government. They're going to help you improve your institutions. And then the final thing that I'll say is just with regards to, you know, it is dangerous right now for civil society to be doing this work in a lot of countries. And so civil society is changing and adapting. There's a lot of movement leaders, but they're not necessarily forming NGOs that can receive funding. And so we've got to be a lot more adaptive in those funding mechanisms. I did want to say something about the championship award that was mentioned. I think that's fantastic. We love showing the good work of our colleagues. Sometimes, you know, some big US government recognition, you know, can put people in danger, and we need to be really careful about that. How we support those colleagues, sometimes quietly is a better way of doing that. We're really worried about a lot of our colleagues in Nicaragua right now who have been disappeared, who are just totally in jeopardy given that situation. And civil society also has to look inside ourselves with the way that we are operating with transparency and integrity, and our local colleagues in the same way. We need to make sure that we're supporting our colleagues to also work in different ways and to be resilient in the face of rising authoritarianism.
Great.
And so I do want to say thank you. Just
Thank
my
you,
last
Julia.
point, Dan, is USAID is doing a lot of really great work with us on the resiliency in the civil society sector, including some of these legitimacy issues. So
Great.
let's keep up the good work on resiliency. Thank you.
Let me bring in some of the other panelists. So there's a question here from Rick, no organization. How can we leverage the private sector in our efforts against corruption, bringing transparency in instances of misinformation? The phenomenon have been especially palpable around national security, democratic events like elections, and health emergencies such as COVID. Shannon, let me start with you.
Thank you so much. So that's actually one of the things I was hoping we would get to is diversifying partnerships. So Julia talked a lot about local partnerships, including at the grassroots level, which I fully agree is very important. And thinking about it not just as working with government or civil society, but really thinking about it in this holistic way, and looking at reformers without and within and how those things come together is super important. But I do think a missing piece of this has been engagement with the private sector. I think Paul was the one that talked a bit about really needing to engage the private sector to root out corruption in the supply chain. USAID is doing some of that work when it comes to natural resources, fisheries, and other areas. However, what I would say is that it's not going to happen easily or naturally. So there's a lot of spade work that needs to go into engagement with the private sector for coalescing different industries around this agenda and working with them to identify in what ways can they contribute. I just had a conversation the other day with somebody about the role of the Commerce Department, for instance, which has not been one of the agencies super involved in this agenda. So I do think there are a lot of ways that we could and should be engaging the private sector. At USAID, obviously, one of the points that we try to make is that fundamentally this is about allowing private sector engage on an equal playing field with other companies in order to open up new markets. And they can only do that if corruption is rooted out, given the standards that U.S. companies are held to. So I do think that's a really important question, and thank you for that.
Thank you. I want to make sure I hear from Paul and Jim. Let me just read a couple other questions, and you guys, Paul and Jim, pick and choose from them. Okay, so one is on this issue of the private sector. How do you bring it in? That's one. Let me read a couple other questions. Frank Vogel from Transparency International. His take is that the G7 summit did not meaningfully address corruption. Does this indicate the reluctance by G7 partners to join the Biden administration's initiative? So you can agree or disagree with his take on that. I believe there was some statement, but so you could have. The another is from Cheryl. I'm going to misspeak her last name, and I'm sorry because sometimes people mispronounce my last name too, so I'm sympathetic. Sharbatke Church, I think I got it. Cheryl Sharbatke Church, and she's at the Fletcher School. There is a dilemma that is faced between INL programming and assistance when dealing with corruption in fragile contexts. And she goes on to try and describe it. I'm having a hard time understanding it, but in terms of could somebody please talk about how this new commitment, how will USAID and INL integrate their anti-corruption, their corruption efforts, especially in stabilization contexts? So something on the private sector, something on what about the G7, and the third is INL, AID, integrating anti-corruption work and in fragile stabilization context. I want to give Paul and Jim each a chance to respond to any of those. Paul, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I can say just real quick on the private sector. I mean, obviously, we're very focused in trying to enlist financial institutions in the fight against illicit finance and corruption. It's one thing for us to talk to our counterparts in the regulatory bodies of a particular jurisdiction, but where the rubber really meets the road is where the banks that are seeing these transactions or are involved in moving illicit proceeds are able to identify that and then have the authorities to act or to act as a prudential matter, as a matter of risk to their own institution, in a way that doesn't provide a conduit for illicit finance. So we certainly have an important convening role in these kinds of dialogues. And we do a number of different public-private dialogues where we try and get regional financial institutions together with government regulators from the region and discuss issues, typologies, that type of thing, so that banks can recognize these sorts of transactions. So I think it's very important to us to enlist that particular aspect of the private sector in this fight. And I should also say that we very much value our interactions with civil society groups. The information we get with respect to corruption, what you're seeing on the ground, how things are financed based on what goes into a lot of our decision making, whether it be sanctions decisions or where to focus our engagements with counterparts and trying to plug these gaps in the international financial system.
Thank you, Jim. Please.
Yeah, real quick, because I know we're running short on time, but I actually would disagree with the question about the G7 and not highlighting anti-corruption enough. I do recognize that the media really picked up on some of the main issues that they are very concerned about and the public concerns about, China, Russia, COVID, climate change. But I can assure you that we had corruption high on the agenda. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of working groups that were established, that have been established, that are taking this issue on. Fighting kleptocracy, following up on the UnGas. These were a lot of major themes that came out of that. So, I imagine we'd hope to be highlighted a little bit more in the media, but it wasn't. But still, I can assure you it was part of it. And just lastly on that point about, I think I understand the question about INL working with USAID on corruption and all these matters, especially in very fragile states. I think we're experiencing this now in Central America, and I know a lot of that has to come down to coordination. And then I know Shannon and her team and my team are already have conversations here in Washington on how we coordinate our embassies, bring those together. I think some of the questions that kind of come into play is like, how do we work with the security forces and community policing kind of aspects, and how do we do no harm? On the civil society aspect, working with them, ensuring that they're in coordination with our broader anti-corruption goals, are all things that we kind of look at and take into consideration. But it's a tough space, as you know, and especially when we're dealing with a lot of times governments that don't necessarily want the reforms that we're asking them to do, and so. That's just the tough part of fighting this. And so I think it's the multi-pronged approach that we're bringing. And I highlight the root cause strategy that we're looking at in Central America is a prime example where we're elevating corruption at the high end of that strategy as that root cause. And then all the programs are basically falling within those lines of objectives.
I want to give everybody 45 seconds each. You get extra credit if you stay within 45 seconds. So Shannon, you go first. Everyone gets 45 seconds for kind of a last parting shot thought.
Okay, great. So on this final point, I do think the important thing is to remember that anti-corruption requires us to focus on prevention, mitigation, and prosecution, right? And that's where I think that working across the U.S. agency and the way that we always have, but is really gaining a lot of steam because of the prioritization of anti-corruption, is going to be really instrumental in making a difference on this very challenging issue. And so I just wanted to equal what Jim said about the collaboration that's happening in the Northern Triangle as being very imperative to address a very complex set of issues that is both domestic and transnational. The final point that I want to make is just that USAID, feels like it's very strongly positioned to engage on this set of issues given its global footprint, but sort of recognizes the need to think and work politically in order to really make a difference on this issue set. So very proud to be back at the agency working on this, and thanks again for this really interesting conversation.
Paul?
I think we're making continual progress on addressing corruption, and obviously the focus of the Biden-Harris administration on this is very important. There's a lot more to be done. I think we've touched on that today. We have to do these things together, linking public, private, and civil society partners at home and abroad. and collaborate in exposing corruption and kleptocracy and take an all tools approach. We've talked about some of the different tools of our respective agencies, but this really is a whole of government and whole of private sector fight. So I thank you for the opportunity to join my colleagues here and look forward to the continued discussion.
Julia?
Sorry, just turning my mic back on. First of all, I would just applaud the Biden-Harris administration for this prioritization. We really appreciate elevating the issue of anti-corruption. We are behind you 100% with regards to civil society. I would just also encourage you that the meaningful representation and participation, that we find those ways for those deep conversations, finding the right champions to invest in, and then letting them lead. And that means sometimes ceding a little bit of power and control with regards to how they're going to do their work, but that we're really ready to accompany all of you to be as successful as possible on this agenda that you've set for yourselves. Thank you.
Jim, you get the last word.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Dan, for putting this together. And I would just conclude by, what do we all want in a society? We want a rules-based society, and that society that can ensure that our safety and our prosperity. And that's really being challenged right now, especially with some authoritarian governments that are taking advantage of corruption around the world and using it for ill-gotten gains. And so I really applaud the Biden and Harris administration and happy to be part of it, where we're taking it from an approach of humility, looking at it from a domestic front and trying to strengthen here domestically, but also going at it from a position of strength overseas and internationally, collaborating with like-minded and having this big, bold concept of a summit for democracies, so we can really have these hard conversations of what's really at stake here. And I really think that I'm just humbled and honored to be part of this fight, and humbled and honored to be part of so many great stakeholders that are working this issue. Thanks again, Dan.
Well, great. Thanks all everybody in government for their public service. Thank you, Julia, for being here. This is great. And thanks everybody for watching. We're going to end it here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.